You're a statistical black guy. You have nothing to live for but prison. Judge Harmon's gavel slams down. Elijah Reed stands. The courtroom goes still. 17-year-old Elijah Reed stood alone at the defendant's table, wrists clasped, heart thudding hard against his ribs, trying not to flinch under the fluorescent glare. He was in his school uniform still, creased khakis, navy polo, the faint outline of a science club badge still pinned near his chest. Judge Ronald E. Mallory leaned forward on the bench, his jowls settling like a gavel before the sentence. A man whose robe gave him power and whose gaze gave nothing but contempt. Well, the judge sneered, voice dripping with disdain. Just another black kid with no future, wasting the court's time with your little science experiments. A few people in the gallery chuckled, soft, cruel laughs from those who had already decided who Elijah was. The bailiff didn't move. The clerk didn't blink. Elijah said nothing. He had learned, from an early age, how silence could be armor. The judge continued, flipping through a police report. A suspicious device near a middle school. Teachers frightened. Bomb squad called. And what was it really? He squinted. An air filter? A box with wires and fans and pollution data? The room's oxygen seemed to drain. It was a science project, Elijah said, voice steady despite the shake in his hands. For the regional STEM fair. The judge snorted. And I suppose I'm expected to believe that nonsense. There was a pause. And then, Elijah spoke again. May I call my father? The gallery burst into low laughter. Someone near the back muttered, Who's he gonna call, LeBron? But Elijah didn't laugh. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded card, the kind that gleams under courtroom light when placed in the right hands. The judge raised an eyebrow. And who exactly is your father, young man? Elijah looked the judge directly in the eye. The United States Attorney General. And just like that, the courtroom went still. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just the cold creak of perception snapping in half. Flashback. A week earlier, Elijah crouched in the back of Mr. Duncan's science lab, fingers dusty from soldering wires onto a circuit board. Beside him sat a shoebox-sized contraption buzzing softly, a DIY air quality monitor fitted with sensors, data chips, and a small fan meant to filter particulate matter. On the screen, blinking red numbers danced, a grim tally of pollution levels measured near his neighborhood, Lincoln Heights. He'd been testing the air since July, mapping the invisible toxins that poured from the chemical plant just 3 blocks from the elementary school. His project title was scrawled on a piece of cardboard. Invisible Chains, Air Pollution and Environmental Racism in Underserved Communities. While other kids built volcanoes or coded drone tricks, Elijah wanted to show how black and brown kids were breathing in harm before they ever reached the classroom. And he had proof. He had charts showing elevated PM2, 5 levels on school playgrounds. He had heat maps that glowed redder over public housing. He had a theory. The location of the plant wasn't a coincidence. It was a choice. One made decades ago and protected by silence. Mr. Duncan beamed with pride. You keep this up, he said, and the judges at the regional fair won't know what hit him. But not everyone was thrilled. When Elijah left the lab that afternoon and placed the device in his backpack, the assistant principal, Mr. Kessler, intercepted him in the hallway. What's that? He asked sharply, eyes narrowing at the tangle of wires and metal peeking from Elijah's bag. A science project, Elijah replied. Kessler frowned. Looks suspicious. You shouldn't bring that kind of thing to school. That night, someone made a call. The next morning, before Elijah could even pull his project from his locker, the building was evacuated. The bomb squad rolled in. A robot clattered down the hallway toward a locked classroom closet where Elijah had stored his air filter for presentation day. No one asked him a single question before the handcuffs clicked shut. Back in the courtroom, the tension hadn't just returned, it had sharpened. Judge Mallory leaned back in his chair, the word Attorney General echoing silently through his skull. His fingers twitched toward his gavel, but he didn't bring it down. Not yet. Elijah stood firm, shoulders squared in that same too big uniform shirt. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, they cut through silence like steel. The judge cleared his throat. You expect us to believe this claim? That your father is Merrick Reed? Elijah nodded once. I don't expect you to believe anything, Your Honor. I just asked for a phone call. The courtroom clerk shifted in her chair. A bailiff near the door swallowed hard. Then, almost too perfectly timed, the courtroom doors opened with a slow, echoing creak. And there he was, Merrick Reed, U.S. Attorney General. 6'3" in a slate gray suit, eyes like sharpened glass, flanked by two silent federal agents in dark coats. He didn't look at the judge. Not yet. He walked straight to his son. Elijah, he said quietly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Dad, Elijah murmured, voice steady. They said I was a threat. Reed turned. Now he looked at the judge. And the storm began. The silence that followed Merrick Reed's arrival wasn't just awkward. It was surgical. Every lawyer, bailiff, and courtroom observer seemed to shrink beneath the weight of authority he carried like a second skin. Judge Mallory straightened in his chair, but his words stumbled. And Mr. Attorney General, I wasn't informed. You weren't meant to be, Reed interrupted calmly. I was notified by my son's school, after the school called the Charleston PD instead of asking a student what he was carrying. Then they called the bomb squad. And then, he turned, locking eyes with Mallory. Somehow, it turned into a juvenile criminal proceeding. Without counsel, without cause. Mallory cleared his throat again. Given the suspicious nature of the device, it was a science project. Reed's voice was low but sharp enough to cut glass. It measured air quality near a known chemical plant. A plant whose emissions have exceeded EPA thresholds for 3 consecutive years. That data was reported to my office 3 weeks ago. Funny timing, don't you think? The judge faltered. Merrick stepped forward, slowly, like a man who already knew the answer to every question he was about to ask. Tell me, Judge Mallory, why exactly did you remand a minor with no prior record, no legal counsel, and no parent present? Why was my son described in the court report as hostile for asking to explain his project? I didn't write that report. But you signed the order, didn't you? The courtroom could have collapsed under the pressure of that pause. And then Merrick spoke again. I'm ordering a federal review of this courtroom. And of this judge. Later that afternoon, the courthouse was no longer a place of whispers. It was under federal lockdown. 2 DOJ investigators had arrived, combing through documents, surveillance footage, and hearing transcripts. The judge's chambers were sealed off, and clerks whispered into phones with pale faces and trembling hands. But Elijah? He sat quietly in a conference room down the hall, sipping from a bottle of orange juice someone had offered him. He watched the swirl of suits moving around him with a calm beyond his years. Merrick Reed stood beside the window, staring out over Charleston Harbor. I should have known, he murmured. What do you mean? Elijah asked. Reed turned, eyes darker now. The chemical plant your project exposed, it's owned by a holding company. That company's majority shareholder? Senator Bill Harland. Elijah blinked. The one who used to chair the Environmental Oversight Committee? The very one. And the judge? Reed nodded grimly. Appointed by Harland 20 years ago. Campaign donor. Former law partner. Mallory's been stalling environmental complaints in this district for a decade, especially when they come from black communities. Elijah looked down at his notebook. His data, once just a school project, now looked like the beginning of a war. I wasn't wrong, he whispered. No, Merrick said, voice tight. You were right, and they knew it. Outside, someone knocked twice, then entered with urgency. Sir, the agent said, you'll want to see this. We've uncovered emails. Judge Mallory was coordinating with Senator Harland's office to suppress litigation related to the plant. Reed didn't even flinch. Start the investigation. Now. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment. His science project had done what no adult had dared. It had exposed the rot hiding in the air, in the system, and now, in the courtroom itself. By morning, The headlines had detonated like fireworks across the country. Teen Science Project triggers federal corruption probe. Judge colluded to bury environmental racism, DOJ confirms. U.S. Attorney General's son wrongfully arrested. Elijah's photo, taken from a school STEM fair months prior, flashed across news outlets. Khaki pants, button-up shirt, a shy smile behind thick glasses. Not a threat, not a criminal, just a boy with data. But now, that boy's data had cracked open a decades-long pattern of injustice. Investigators revealed dozens of complaints from Black residents living near the same chemical plant Elijah had studied. Complaints about asthma, about foul-smelling air on playgrounds, about hospital visits that never seemed to matter to anyone at City Hall. Those complaints had been lost, over and over, lost or buried. Emails unearthed in Judge Mallory's account showed he regularly coordinated with legal teams connected to Harlan's donors. The judge had quietly dismissed or delayed over 30 environmental cases that might have exposed the pollution. Elijah's science project? It wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous because it told the truth in numbers no one could ignore. And behind the scenes, Senator Harlan was already moving, calling in favors, trying to spin the narrative. But it was too late. Merrick Reed had personally assigned a DOJ special counsel. He didn't want headlines. He wanted accountability. And Elijah? He just wanted to finish what he started. The first time Elijah sat down for a live interview, he wore the same navy blazer he'd saved for college visits. Cameras hovered like insects. The anchor smiled too widely, and the lights were too bright. But Elijah spoke with quiet certainty. "What made you build the air monitor?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "I got tired of my classmates coughing during gym." Laughter rippled through the studio. But Elijah didn't laugh. "It wasn't just bad luck. We live next to the plant. Our school's playground is downwind. And I thought, if I can measure it, I can prove it. If I can prove it, maybe someone will care." They cared now. His findings were being reviewed by the EPA. His methodology had been validated by scientists at MIT. Lawmakers in 2 states were introducing Elijah's Law, requiring mandatory air quality testing in public schools located near industrial zones. But not everyone was celebrating. Elijah had to deactivate his personal social media accounts after threats poured in. Liar. Planted by the left. Puppet for his daddy. Some even called the science fake, just like they'd called his future non-existent a week ago. Still, he stayed calm. Steady. Measured. Just like his readings. "You were humiliated in court," one reporter asked. "How did you stay so composed when that judge called you just another black kid with no future?" Elijah leaned forward. "Because I knew he was wrong." By the end of the second week, Judge Mallory was suspended pending a formal ethics review. The hearing room was packed. He arrived with his lawyer and a carefully neutral expression, but nothing could hide the undercurrent of panic in his hands as he adjusted his glasses. He tried to frame his actions as cautious, based on protocol, concerned for public safety. But the evidence said otherwise. The leaked emails, the pattern of dismissals, the racial disparity in his rulings, stark and irrefutable. And then there was the footage, courtroom security tapes showing his expression, his tone, the laughter from the gallery when Elijah asked to call his father. The moment the judge smirked, leaned forward, and said, "Just another black kid with no future." That sentence would be played on loop in every hearing, every article, every call for judicial reform. Senator Harlan didn't fare much better. As the corruption probe widened, lobbyists tied to his campaigns began to vanish from public roles. One aide was indicted for destroying public complaints tied to the plant. Harlan went on camera, red-faced, trying to call it a misunderstanding. But Merrick Reed wasn't backing down. He appeared before Congress and laid out the facts, calmly, methodically, devastatingly. "This wasn't just environmental neglect," he said. "It was environmental racism, weaponized through silence." And at the center of it all, a 17-year-old with a circuit board, a question, and the courage to demand answers. In a quiet room at the Charleston Science Museum, Elijah stood beside his air quality monitor, now encased in glass. A plaque read, "One voice, one device. How a teen scientist sparked a national reckoning." He watched his family stop to read the display. Some kids pointed at the wires, amazed. Others lingered at the interactive map showing pollution data. His data, still updating in real time thanks to a national grant. What he'd started in a school lab had become a national pilot program. Over 300 schools in marginalized communities were now outfitted with air monitors built on Elijah's design. His open-source code was being used by student groups in Detroit, East St. Louis, Fresno, and the readings told a story that policy had long ignored. In places where Black and brown kids lived, the air was consistently dirtier. Worse still, hospital data now matched it: spikes in asthma, higher ER visits, lower birth weights. His project hadn't just exposed a bad actor. It had confirmed a truth many had whispered about for generations. He wasn't a student anymore. He was a symbol, and symbols carry weight. As he looked at his own face on a museum banner, Elijah whispered under his breath, "Let the data speak." And finally, people were listening. Elijah returned to his school for the first time since the incident in silence. No reporters, no cameras, just him, a backpack, and the smell of autumn clinging to the hallways. Some kids avoided eye contact. Others whispered behind locker doors. But one girl, Tiana, a sophomore he'd helped in robotics club, walked straight up and said, "You were right. They just didn't want to hear it." That meant more than any headline. He walked past the science lab. Mr. Duncan's classroom door was open, the same cluttered chaos of wires, microscopes, and beakers. Duncan looked up and smiled like nothing had changed. But everything had. "Elijah," he said, rising from his desk, "you didn't just prove your hypothesis. You cracked the foundation." They hugged. No words needed. Later, at a school assembly, the principal nervously invited Elijah on stage. "To honor one of our brightest minds," she said, her voice straining with guilt, "and to apologize on behalf of this institution." But Elijah didn't speak for long. "I'm not here because I was brave," he told the student body. "I'm here because I was curious. I asked why our air was dirty, why no one seemed to care, and I got punished for asking the wrong question in the wrong place." He paused. Let that sit. But the truth is, the right question, asked loud enough, can change everything. The gym erupted. Behind closed doors in Washington, Elijah's name had become a quiet force. During a Senate subcommittee hearing on environmental justice, his air monitor sat on the witness table, alongside graphs, medical records, and expert testimonies, all citing his data. Senator Harland was no longer present. He'd stepped down quietly weeks earlier. But Merrick Reed was there. "I never imagined my son would be the one to expose the corruption we'd been circling for years," he said, his voice composed but steely. But maybe it had to be a kid, because grown men stopped asking questions a long time ago. The committee listened. The hearings resulted in the passage of the Clean Zones Act, targeting industrial zoning laws in low-income communities. It also established an independent Office of Environmental Equity within the EPA. Its first data set? Elijah's. Even the president requested to meet him. In the Oval Office, Elijah stood next to a mahogany desk and shook hands with a man who towered in the polls, but still bent slightly to look him in the eye. "You made the country look closer," the president said. "We owe you." Elijah didn't smile. He simply replied, "Just make sure no other kid has to prove the air is killing them." In the months that followed, Elijah launched a nonprofit, Clear Breath Initiative, a youth-led coalition dedicated to environmental justice, education, and community science. Their mission was simple: teach kids to test their own air, document injustice, and speak truth, no matter the cost. Elijah traveled to schools across the country, not as a celebrity, not even as a cautionary tale, but as a guide. In Milwaukee, he sat cross-legged on a gym floor, teaching fifth graders how to read PM2.5 monitors. In Jackson, Mississippi, he helped students rig filtration units from shoeboxes and recycled fans. He ended every session the same way. This isn't about science class. It's about survival. If you can measure it, they can't ignore it. Media outlets tried to paint him as a prodigy, a genius, a symbol of resilience. But Elijah kept correcting them. I'm not special, he'd say. I just didn't back down. And that honesty hit harder than any viral soundbite. Teachers began incorporating his methods into lesson plans. A tech company offered to mass-produce his sensors. And at a conference for youth activists, a young girl from Newark approached him with tearful eyes and whispered, "I didn't know we could fight back until you did." He handed her one of the original monitors. You can. Back in Charleston, the courtroom that once humiliated Elijah now bore a permanent scar. Judge Mallory was formally disbarred. His record expunged, his rulings reviewed. And in a rare televised statement, the Chief Justice of South Carolina stood at a podium and said, "The bench must reflect justice, not bias. This failure will not be ignored." It was the first time the state acknowledged systemic racial bias in its lower courts. A plaque now hung outside the courtroom, in honor of Elijah Reed, whose courage illuminated injustice and demanded better. Elijah visited it once alone. He ran his fingers over the cool metal, letting the weight of the moment settle. Not revenge, not even victory, just a reminder that systems break quietly until someone makes noise. As he turned to leave, a janitor nearby paused his sweeping. "You know," the man said, "I was there that day. Saw you stand there, straight as a pole, when that judge tried to crush you." Elijah nodded. The janitor smiled. "You didn't blink. And now the whole world's watching." And maybe that was the point. Not to burn it all down, but to force everyone to see the smoke they'd been breathing for years. Elijah stood beneath the towering arches of the National Science Forum, holding a small black box in his hands. His original air monitor, now upgraded with new sensors, better memory, and solar-powered durability. The box hadn't changed the world on its own, but it had started something. During his keynote speech, he didn't thank the institutions. He didn't quote policy. He thanked his neighborhood. "I built this because my friend Malik couldn't run more than 5 minutes without coughing," he said. "Because my little sister got nosebleeds when it got too hot. Because my grandma used to say, 'Baby, if you want to fix the world, start by cleaning the air around you.'" He looked out at the crowd, students, scientists, community leaders. "So that's what I did." Applause swelled, but Elijah didn't smile right away. He let the weight settle. "Then, I wasn't supposed to be heard. I was supposed to be dismissed, forgotten, punished." Pause. But truth doesn't care who tells it. It just waits for someone to listen. That moment rippled through every corner of the auditorium. Because he wasn't asking for applause. He was handing them responsibility. It was spring when Elijah returned home. Lincoln Heights smelled different now. Fresher. The plant had been ordered to reduce emissions by 70%. New trees lined the schoolyard. A permanent air quality sensor, based on Elijah's design, stood tall beside the playground fence, sending real-time updates to a public dashboard. Kids played beneath it, unbothered, unaware that the air they breathed used to be dangerous. That was the goal. Elijah sat on the front porch beside his father. No speeches, no cameras, just father and son, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. "You know," Merrick said, "you changed more than laws." Elijah looked up. "You changed the way people see kids like you." Elijah didn't answer right away. He was watching the stars, finally visible through the cleaner night sky. Then he said, "I didn't do it alone." Merrick nodded. "But you made the first spark." They sat in silence for a while, listening to cicadas sing and tires hum softly down the street. And in that stillness, Elijah allowed himself something rare. Hope. Because the fight wasn't over. But for the first time, the wind was at their backs. And the air, at last, was clear. Thank you for watching. Subscribe me and hit the notification bell to not miss new stories. Bye.